Hey everyone, welcome to this week's bonus episode where I'm going to answer questions from our listeners at the Democracy Defender level and higher. Some of the folks that keep our show going. Thank you so much, everyone who supports the show. And if you want to get bonus episodes, submit your own questions to our regular Q&As, just sign up at patreon.com/gaslit. That's patreon.com/gaslit. And a reminder, I'm going to be joining a roundtable discussion with a group of Russian organizers who are anti-war organizers. They've been at it since the start of Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2014. We had this same sort of roundtable discussion when Nemtsov was murdered in 2015, and now Navalny's been killed. So they're organizing again. This was already in process, but this event's going to take on a much more urgent meaning now that Navalny is gone, deliberately taken to try to intimidate groups like this one. It's not just to silence the Russians at home, but Russians around the world. So that roundtable discussion will be happening virtually on Thursday, February 29 at 1 p.m. Eastern. Look out for the link in the show notes for this episode. Anyone can join from anywhere. It's going to be in English. There may be some Russian thrown in. I'm going to be speaking there about Mr. Jones and working, Ukrainians and Russians and all of us uniting wherever we are and doing what we can wherever we are. So I look forward to that. And I'm grateful for everybody who is organizing and working hard despite the fear, despite the terror they're deliberately inflicting against us. The whole goal is to shine your light in their faces and not back down and be defiant. That is how we win. That is how the generations that came before us won. In 2024, this is our year. Remember, we're not just going to survive, we're going to thrive. So be sure to set some very big, meaningful goals for yourself, some stretch goals, because you cannot let this year go to waste. You cannot just be living in fear, anxiety because of this election that's coming up. It's happening. We're all going to go through it. We're all going to fight like hell. We're all linked arm in arm to ensure that our democracy prevails, not just here at home, but around the world. Because if America falls, that's it. It's going to be game over for a lot of countries around the world. And it's going to get exponentially worse because the fascists will be building momentum off of that, just like they're building momentum off of 2016, having gotten Trump in the first place. So we're not going to let that happen. We're not. We're going to have a very big year. We're going to look back on 2024 as one of the best years of our lives, a meaningful year. And we're going to fight like hell together and leave nobody behind. We're going to do it. All right, so let's get into the questions from our listeners. Again, thank you everyone at the Democracy Defender level and higher on Patreon. Thank you. First question up is from Holly. Holly writes, does the US have more prisoners by numbers or percentages than Russia? And Holly writes that in response to a comment I'd made in an earlier bonus show, I believe. So I'm going to do a deep dive on this. And yeah, so the numbers are staggering. According to the Prison Policy Initiative, quote, the United States currently incarcerates around 700 per 100,000 people. Less than 5% of the world's population is in the United States, but 20% of the world's incarcerated people are right here in the US. And I'll link to their reports of the Prison Policy Initiative, which I'm quoting in the show notes for this week's bonus show. The organization produced a report called "The U.S. Continues to be the World Leader in Incarceration." And that report is just damning. Let me just read from that report. The U.S. rate of around 700 prisoners per 100,000 population is now greater than the Russian rate, which declined from 730 per 100,000 people in 1999 to 644 per 100,000 people in 2001. So the US and Russia are pretty close in numbers. That data has been pretty consistent. You might be wondering, well, what about the war with Putin locking up everyone? What are the numbers now? It's hard to get those numbers. It's very hard because Russia is a dictatorship. Those numbers are probably quite large today because of the war. I mean, the news this week that the Russians just arrested a Russian-American woman from LA for marching against the war all the way in LA. That's very much how they treat the diaspora. So we're going to get into some really staggering statistics here, thanks to the Prison Policy Initiative. From their 2021 report, 2021, and this is before Putin went full totalitarian in 2022 and launching his total war against Ukraine and locking up everyone. So in 2021, from a report from the Prison Policy Initiative, these are the states, the US states, with the highest incarceration rates, okay? So if you look at America's incarceration numbers and break it down by states, blue states, red states, however you want to identify them, those numbers across the board are still higher than dictatorships, whatever they were, like in places like Russia back in 2021, which wasn't so long ago. And guess who has the crowning achievement of the highest incarceration rates in all of the United States? The state is so obvious. If you know American history, if you know what's going on in America today, the number one state for incarceration rates in America is Louisiana, which stays true to its brutal history since the time of slavery. You know that saying, to sell someone down the river, which means to harm someone by taking advantage of them. That came from selling enslaved people on riverboats that would then take them down to the slave market, the infamous notorious slave market in Louisiana, which had the most sadistic slavery systems during the centuries of slavery. As an enslaved person, one of the worst places you could end up was Louisiana, where they would just totally dehumanize you. And that genocidal, institutionalized way of thinking continues today with Louisiana's extraordinarily high incarceration rates. And also with Louisiana Congressman Mike Johnson, Speaker of the House, intentionally blocking desperately needed aid in Ukraine and deliberately assisting Russia's ongoing genocide of Ukrainians. The root of evil is all the same. Mike Johnson can casually sell Ukrainians down the river to the enslavement of Russians, because that is how Ukrainians in captivity are treated, because white genocidal men like him have been doing that in Louisiana for generations and continue to do this today to non-white people who intentionally suffer white supremacy-driven genocide by being arrested and killed by police, including starting as young as middle school, with non-white children of all ages disproportionately being subjected to aggressive so-called disciplinary targeting, significantly more than white children in schools, and so on. The larger point is this: if a group of people, like Republicans in America, can be genocidal to one group, it makes it easier for them to be genocidal to another group, because they believe in genocide as a tool for consolidating and holding on to power. This is a tradition that runs through their institutions, oftentimes even their families, for generations. It's all the same root of evil. So it's no surprise that the Kremlin caucus in Congress that deliberately, proudly blocks aid to Ukraine comes from states with the highest prison populations, that target groups that experience generations of slavery and currently face over-policing and lawfare and disenfranchisement laws to strip them of the right to vote or make it harder to vote, especially former and current convicted felons and so on. So let's look at the states in the United States of America with the highest prison populations, starting with the highest and working our way down. And you'll see they're all so-called red states led by Republicans. Like the highest rankings are largely Republican-led. So topping the list, of course, Louisiana, Mississippi, Oklahoma, the state of Georgia, Arkansas, Alabama, Kentucky. There's Arizona, which only recently became a bit bluer. That's a recent trend. Then you have Wyoming, Texas, Tennessee, South Dakota, Florida, Montana, Indiana, Idaho, Virginia. Virginia's been a bit bluer in recent years, but it's still one you got to watch. Missouri, New Mexico, West Virginia, Alaska, Nevada, again, blue but barely. Kansas, South Carolina, Wisconsin, with some brass-knuckled Republicans that make that state very close. Pennsylvania has a very scary Republican Party, and thanks to a lot of grassroots investment, including from groups like mine, the State Fair Project, which raised over $100,000 to help flip the local legislature of Pennsylvania from Republican control to blue, bringing in something like flipping like 12 seats, something massive like that. But Pennsylvania has just dirty Republicans there, and Moms of Liberty and all that. Ohio, Again, Ohio's basically gone the way of Missouri and fallen to Republicans. Delaware has some shitty Democrats who lead that state and vote against and hide behind Kristen Sinema and Joe Manchin in voting down, raising the minimum wage and so on. And they don't get as much heat as Manchin and Sinema because they're like not as heinous as those two, but still bad. There's North Carolina, Colorado, which is, Colorado is a bit of a mix. There's some progressive successes there, though, especially in places like Denver, Nebraska, Michigan, where a full-on group tried to kidnap and rape Gretchen Whitmer. Then you have North Dakota and Iowa. So there you have it. The list that tops it in the US, Republican-led or very close swing states that we all have to fight like hell for election cycle after election cycle. And then coming down that list, you have El Salvador, Oregon, Turkmenistan, California, Maryland, Rwanda, Cuba, which is a dictatorship, Illinois, Washington State, Thailand, Hawaii, Utah, Panama, Connecticut, New York, Costa Rica, Uruguay, Brazil, Belarus, which is a dictatorship, Minnesota, New Jersey, Turkey, Nicaragua, and then finally, Russian Federation. The list goes on to name other US states and countries and so on, but that's where you have the Russian Federation falling as of this 2021 report. So obviously this number very likely went up. Russia likely jumped up this list because of Putin going full totalitarian and arresting a lot of people for doing like small acts of like holding up an anti-war sign in public or whatever. So this report should get updated. But the larger point is this: even if this report were to get updated, it's safe to say that American states, whether considered red or blue, would still probably be largely higher than Russia or at the very minimum equal to Russia. And that's the problem. I do want to point out, to give some much needed context here, Russia itself is a prison. There are no elections. There's no free press. And Russians self-censor themselves by largely living in fear or fleeing abroad. So that's important to keep in mind here. Dictatorships keep the people in check and controlled in other ways. You don't need prison. Dictators turn the entire society in prison. And then people just police themselves because they've internalized the prison, the panopticon, where they feel like they're always being watched. That's how it was during the Soviet era. That's how it is with Putin today. It's why we don't see more, one of the reasons we don't see more mass protests there on the regular and more Navalny's. But yeah, that's America. This is America. And so if you want to know more about the work of the Prison Policy Initiative, check out the show notes and organize locally where you live to elect people to local office. Local office, your state government, determines the quality of life where you live. They determine all the quality of life laws, including, well, obviously the feds control the federal prisons, but you can also push back on that by electing humane prosecutors, humane judges, and electing people to office who believe in reform. It's pretty perverse. It's pretty dystopian to have, for America to consistently lead with having the largest prison population in the world, including outflanking dictatorships, the ones we consider ourselves to be morally responsible compared to those dictatorships. We have to really push locally where we live to force America to finally live by the values that a lot of our leaders proclaim. And we can do that. And if you want to know where to start, check out the Gaslit Nation Action Guide at gaslitnationpod.com. All right, so Deborah has a question. She writes in, listening now to Liz Cheney's interview with The New Yorker, and I'm scratching my head.